Button. All right, so welcome to the November Arundecoit Public Library Genealogy Group meeting. We are very happy to have both people in person and on Zoom tonight. We're expecting a good crowd, and I've got quite a few people here tonight. And thank you for coming. I am Nancy Cowan, the library, or one of the librarians at the Arundecoit Library, and I am the one that facilitates the genealogy group and gets the speakers and sends out all of the reminders and follow-up emails after the meeting. This, like I said, is going to be recorded, and our speaker, Dave Lowry, is allowing us to keep it on our YouTube channel indefinitely. So thank you so much, Dave, for letting us do that. So people can watch it at their leisure if they want to see it the second time or whatever. Let's see. So anybody that is joining us from Zoom, if you could put in the chat where you're joining us from. It's always nice to see what parts of the country or the world that we're getting people tuning in from. And thank you for doing that. I think everybody has been muted on their way in to the Zoom. We're going to wait for questions until the end. If you're on Zoom, if you want to put a question on the chat, and then I will be monitoring the chat, and then we can ask Dave when he finishes his presentation. Let's see. I think we are ready to start. So Dave, again, this is Dave Lowry from the New York State Archives. I'm very excited to have you here. And I would love if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and then get started.
Okay, great, thanks. Yes, I'm the manager of local government advisory services for the New York State Archives in Albany. So what I overdo is I oversee all the services we provide at the archives for local governments. So I've been working for local government and with local governments for about 30 years. I've become familiar with the records. I'm also a genealogist myself. I'm a member of the Capital District Genealogical Society. So I've also been doing genealogy research for about 30 years as well. So what I'd like to do is just kind of jump into this and get started. And that did not go forward. Let's see. There we go. Okay, so just a quick agenda here. What I first want to do is I'm going to provide a quick overview of New York State local government. New York State local government can be a bit confusing. We have a lot of it in the state with a lot of overlapping jurisdictions. Then get into the meat of it. This is, we're going to review local government records useful in genealogy research. And then finally, I'm going to give you some tips on the best way to access these records. It's not always easy to access local government records in New York State. So first, let's take a quick look at local governments in New York State. So the first thing you're going to notice here is we've got a lot of local government in New York. Okay, according to the what we've done at the archives, we've got about 4,400 local governments. You can see here on the top, these are what we call general purpose governments. These are the ones you're probably most familiar with. You can see here we got 62 counties, 62 cities, 932 towns, and 533 villages. But don't forget, in New York, we also have other types of local governments, including school districts, fire districts, and miscellaneous governments. And we call these at the bottom special purpose or single purpose governments. And that is because, as their name suggests, they generally only do one thing. For instance, school districts, they educate children, or general purpose governments, they provide a lot of different services to their constituents. So let's take a quick look at the main government types, these general purpose governments. Counties. Now, counties were originally just meant to be subdivisions of the state, but over the centuries, they've morphed into municipalities. They're very much like cities and towns, and they provide a lot of those same services. So cities. So a city is chartered by the state. And the important thing to remember about a city is once it's chartered by the state, it becomes independent of the town where it was. Okay, so they become completely different entities. Another important thing for New York and New York State to remember about cities is, contrary to popular belief, there is no size requirement. So for instance, the city of Sherrill, which is in Oneida County, only has 3,000 people in it, where the village of Hempstead on Long Island has 54,000. All right, so you can't always tell by whether it's a city or a village how big it might be. So towns, and I'm going to ask you, please, please do not call them townships. A lot of people use that term in New York State. New York State does not have townships like New England. We only have towns, okay? And they are the primary unit of municipal government in New York State. So what do I mean by that? If you do not live in a city, you do not live on an Indian reservation, you live in a town, okay? So that's just a very easy way to remember it. Now, villages, some people do get confused by villages. What a village is, it's an incorporated area within a town or town. So a village could lie within two different towns. Matter of fact, up in the North Country, the village of Saranac Lake actually lies within 3 towns and 2 counties, okay? So I know that can get a bit confusing. So important thing to remember about a village for genealogists is a village is still part of the town. So if you live in a village, you still are technically a resident of the town. So if you're going to go look for records because you know your ancestor lived in a village, also you're going to want to check out the records of the town as well, because he also lived in that town. Another important thing to remember about villages is they can essentially choose the services they want to give. Some villages provide only a few services. They might just do things like zoning and building. And some of them are full service villages where they provide the same exact services as towns or cities. And one special note about villages, thankfully, New York State was smart. And when they pass village dissolution laws, so that's when a village is dissolved by a vote, what the law says is those records then go to the town where the village lies. Okay, so if you're doing research and you find out your ancestor lived in a particular village that, say, was dissolved 50 years ago, you know then that the records will be with the town. And just one last thing about local government structure before we move on is the concept of locations versus jurisdictions. So for instance, here's an example. What's a hamlet versus a village? Well, a hamlet is a small population cluster within a town, right? So similar to a village, except a hamlet does not actually have a government, so it doesn't have any jurisdiction. It's merely a location on a map. Okay, so sometimes you may hear them referred to as an unincorporated village, and often there are post offices and census enumeration districts. Okay, but they have no jurisdiction, so you can't go to a hamlet to do research because a hamlet doesn't have any records because it doesn't actually have a government. So if you know the name of a hamlet your ancestor lived in, you have to go to the town where that hamlet is located. Okay, so let's get into the heart of it, and that's the local government records. So first, just a few things to remember as we start talking about these records. Records collections are not uniform across the government type. Okay, so just because you find one type of record, say in a town, does not mean the neighboring town will have those same records. So for instance, you may find that a town has a Civil War roster, right, of all the soldiers who fought from that town in the Civil War. That doesn't necessarily mean the town next to it will have those records, okay? Different government types may hold the same or similar records. So for instance, a lot of different local governments hold tax collection records, right? So a county might, a school district, a town, a village. So you may find those similar records across different local government types. Now, not all records that are held by a local government are local government records. Sometimes they're state records. And I'll point this out as we go along and we talk about the different types of records. And then finally, something many of you probably suspect already, New York City is often the exception to the rule. Okay. In Albany, we folks in state service, we have a saying. There is the state of New York, and then there is the state of the city of New York. Okay, New York City is very large, and they have a lot more autonomy than other local governments, including over things like vital records, which we'll talk about as we move along. Okay. The first one here that many of you may be familiar with are the state census records. Now, again, obviously, these are state records created by New York State, but they're also deposited with the county clerk. So you can find them on the local level. So from 1825 to 1925, the state of New York took a census similar to what the federal government does, except instead of every 10 years ending in a 0, they did it every 10 years ending in a 5. There is, of course, one exception between 1875 and 1905. There was only the 1892 census. There wasn't one taken in 1885. So instead of waiting another 10 years, they did one in 1892 and then again in 1905. So copies are kept at the state and county level, except there is some very bad news about the state copies. 1911, there was a fire at the state capitol where all of the state's historic records were stored, and they were destroyed. So from 1825 to 1905, you'll only find them at the local level. Now, good news is a lot of the counties do have fairly complete sets from about 1855 to 1925. Before that, it gets a little sketchy. And you can see here, I noted that only Chautauqua and Steuben counties have complete sets from 1825 to 1925. So you can see, unfortunately, a chunk of that got lost. So there's some access tips. I'm going to quick talk about Ancestry New York, for those of you who may not be familiar with it. If you go to the New York State Archives website, which you can see on the bottom of each slide here, archives.nysed.gov, you can sign up for an Ancestry New York account. So what this is we have a deal with Ancestry. We have let them digitize a lot of our records, but they have to provide free access to New York State residents. So you can go to our website. We have instructions there. You can sign up for a free Ancestry New York account if you do not already have access to ancestry.com. Okay, and they have most of the records from 1855 to 1925. Family Search has a lot of the pre-1855 ones. And you can still go to the county clerks, right, and see which records they have. And if you really want to look at the original paper records, a lot of the county clerks will actually let you look at those. But you'd have to inquire with them exactly what years they have. And just wanted to show you a quick picture here. This is from the first state census, 1825 for Chautauqua County. You could see here they're similar to the pre-1840 federal census records, which just lists the head of the household and then just tabulate everybody else in columns. And I can tell you too that the state censuses from year to year do have different information in them. So here's one folks may not think about too much. There is such a thing as school census records. So with compulsory education in New York State came a need to count all these school-aged children within a particular district. So what the state did is they started mandating these school censuses to take place. Now, the most common period you can still find is between 1895 and 1928. This is when the state education department created these uniform forms that all school districts throughout the state had to use. And I'll show you an example of that in a moment. Now you can find some earlier census records before that. Sometimes you can find them going back even into the early part of the 19th century. And sometimes you'll also find things like attendance registers. And here's a special note. City school districts, the law said the census was actually conducted by the police commissioners. So if you're going to try to find some school census records in a city school district, it might not actually be with a school district. It might actually be with the city, and even maybe still be with the city police department. So you'd have to inquire about that if you're looking at city school district records. Okay, but here is a tip. Access can be a bit difficult. The first thing you'd have to deal with is where are the records. There's been a lot of school consolidation over the years. In the early 20th century, New York State, believe it or not, had over 10,000 school districts. Now, they've been consolidated down over the years. We have about 800 today. So tracking where those records went to can be a bit difficult. Not surprisingly, some of them did get lost. So you'd have to try to track and see if you can get to what's called the successor school district, and hopefully it may be with them. Now, sometimes they also did end up with other local governments, say with a town, a village, or sometimes you'll actually find they fell into the hands of the local historical society. So these records can be very interesting and useful, but you might have to dig a little bit for them. They're not as easy to use as some other local government records. Now, here is a picture of one you could see here. It has the name of the student and then the student guardian. And there is a lot more to these records than this what you see here. Oftentimes they also recorded the names of the teachers, okay, administrators, they had budget information, and oftentimes also the taxpayers as well. So you can find a lot of names and a lot of information in these records, again, if you can find them. You can see here, this is one from a census record that I found at the town of Colony, one of the school districts there, and it's from 1915. And these, this is an example of the forms I was mentioning that were created by the New York State Education Department for all the school districts in New York to use. So vital records, those are our birth, death, and marriage records. Now, for you more experienced genealogists, I'm sure you know that vital records in New York can be quite the challenge. And here are just some of the problems you'll face. First of all, we have two vital records systems in New York State. Remember my comment about New York City? Well, New York City has its own vital record system. That means that any vital records event that takes place in the city of New York, they do not send a copy to Albany like all other municipalities outside of New York City do. So you're going to have to know where the event took place and when. So for instance, New York City, as we think of today, the 5 boroughs, was created in 1898. So if great-grandpa was born in Queens in 1903, then the record would be with New York City. However, if great-grandpa was born in Queens in 1891, then hopefully New York State would have the copy of it, and you go to the state and not the city. Another big problem was vital records laws were just completely ignored. Some people believe that the first vital records law in New York State was actually the one in 1880. Actually, the first one was in 1665. But local governments, we love home rule in New York State. They just tended to ignore a lot of these laws. Another big problem with New York is strict access laws, okay? It wasn't until very recently that people could even easily access the indexes to the state records, okay? New York City is a lot more open, as I'll discuss in a moment, but the state records, for some odd reason, New York State will somehow thinks that a marriage record from 1887 is confidential. Now, this is different from a lot of other states. If you've done research outside of New York, I've done a lot in New England, and I can tell you those records are open, they're indexed, they've been imaged, and they're online. Not New York State, though. If you were to request a copy of a vital record from the New York State Department of Health, a vital record section, it could literally take you a couple of years, not months, years, to get a response. So what you're going to want to do is go to the actual municipality where the event took place. Hopefully you can find that in the index. And usually they're very good about fulfilling them within a couple of weeks. Now, there are some exceptions to the rules, okay? Usually in New York, it is the municipalities, meaning a town, a city, or village, that holds the record. However, we do have 4 counties in New York, and one of them should be very familiar to you, that are the registrars of vital statistics. And they are Chemung, Monroe, Onondaga, and Tompkins County. So if you have ancestors from any of those counties, you can go to the county and not to the actual municipality. And then finally, villages, going back to villages, again, they can choose essentially what services they provide. So they can choose to be the registrar of vital statistics, or they can choose not to be. So you need to research that a little bit, see if that record is with the village. If you contact the village, they will normally tell you that, no, you've got to go to the town. Another thing to remember, villages do not issue marriage licenses, nor do they perform marriage ceremonies, and you will not find a marriage record at the village level. That will always be the town. Okay. So those were the vital records problems. Here are some of your solutions. Now, a lot of the indexes for both the state and the city are online. The state more recently. And for New York City, as many of you may know who've done research there, the German Genealogy Group and the Italian Genealogy Group created indexes to them. And hopefully many of you heard by now that New York City began digitizing all of these vital records, those ones that are open by law, and you can actually go to their site now, the New York City Archives, use the index and actually get a copy of that record. Now, some large cities had vital records laws by the 1870s. So a city like Buffalo or Yonkers, if you were lucky enough to have some ancestors from there, starting in the 1870s, you should be able to find those records. There was a law in New York State that marriage records had to be filed with the county clerk as well as the local registrar. And that law was in effect, you can see here, from 1908 to 1935. So you can find these records. They have been digitized and indexed. They are on Family Search. And for some reason, the state of New York, a quirk in the law, says these records are not confidential. And of course, you can go to Family Search and do a search. And actually, I've used those records myself. A lot of good information in them if you had ancestors who got married between that time period in New York. Another thing you can do is check what's often called old town books. If you're not familiar with these, going back into the early part of the 19th century and before that, towns generally kept all their records in one big book. So you flip through these books, and on one page, the town board minutes are on one page, tax records the next, and then on the next page, you might actually find a birth record or a death record or a marriage record. The thing with most of these books, of course, are not indexed. If you're lucky, sometimes you may find a transcribed copy, but you'd actually have to go through the old book page by page in order to find the record. And just a quick note, obviously these are not local government records, but in New York, more than any other state, we really have to rely on church and other religious institutional records to try to substitute for those vital records that we do not have in New York. Land records. These are one of my favorites. Now, when I first started doing genealogy research, I really didn't see the value a lot of times in land records. And so if you're a newbie, you may not either. You may be thinking it's like, well, okay, my ancestor owned a piece of land with a house on it somewhere. Who cares? But there's a lot of great information in these records. So for land records, you have deeds, mortgages, land patents, and maps. Now, deeds, of course, is the conveyance of property, real property, from one person or persons to another. And what's great about these is they often have a detailed description of the property saying, okay, it starts at such and such a spot and then runs up to the the property of this person, then to that person. So you could see who your ancestors' neighbors were. And oftentimes his neighbors may have been family members, in-laws, people like that. Mortgages can help you trace them back as well. Now, land patents, those are the original land grants from the state to the original owner of that individual owner of that land. You can also often find these in old town records and things like that, the original patent holders. Maps, especially maps starting around 1850, oftentimes recorded the name of the landowner on the map. Especially in smaller towns, they may literally list every single landowner and show you where their land was. And again, this is great for getting a good visual about, who your ancestors' neighbors were, who his friends, other family were. Really useful. Now, where do you find these records? Of course, with the county clerks in New York State. Now, in New York City, there is the Register of Deeds, and it is registered, not registrar. Sometimes people always think that that's a mistake, but it is Register of Deeds. Now, that does not include Richmond County, which is Staten Island. They do actually keep their own deeds at the county clerk's office there. But for the other 4 boroughs, you would have to go there. Now, sometimes you will find these records with towns or cities, even though there were laws saying you have to record your deed at the county clerk's office. If the county seat was far from your ancestor, or maybe, who knows, he was just a little lazy, he might just go down to the town and ask the clerk, could you just please record this deed for me? So if you don't find it at the county level, I would check with the town or city where your ancestor may have lived. And again, this was something that people didn't always do, even though the law said they should. Especially, you'll find before 1800, it's going to be hit or miss in finding those deeds. Court records, these are another one of my favorites. You can find a lot of really great information in court records. So court records, again, they're state records are held by general purpose governments. Now, in New York State, the county clerk is also the clerk of the Supreme and county courts. So they are the person who's going to hold those records, okay? And now, if you look at the county and even at the city level, oftentimes you'll find records of defunct courts. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go over some of these courts we had in New York State. Some of them are no longer exist, but the records often do. Okay. So first, we need to keep in mind, right, there are 2 types of court cases. There's the civil cases. That's when one person or person sues another person or person for some kind of damage. Oftentimes it's debt. So those are cases like Smith versus Jones. Then, of course, there are criminal cases, and those are when a person, of course, is arrested and indicted for committing a crime. So those are usually the state versus Jones, the people versus Smith, ones like that. And it's important to know what courts heard what kind of cases. So the first one here I wanted to tell you about is actually not at the local level, but I think it's important for you to know this, and it is the Court of Chancery. You can see here, it's a pretty big wide date range we have here, all the way from 1683 to 1847. And these records are with the New York State Archives in Albany. And the important thing to remember about the Court of Chancery records is they have guardianship records, which of course for genealogists are valuable. The guardianship records, of course, are those records when a child's parents die and they don't have a guardian, or sometimes it was just the father, they would appoint a legal guardian to oversee, that child's legal rights. Now, we also had the Court of Common Pleas. That was from 1691 to 1847. Now, you notice the date 1847 is popping up here a few times. That's because in 1847, New York State had a very big court restructuring law that was passed. So this is why you'll keep seeing this. So this was a county level court, and it did hear civil cases. Now, there was also something called the Mayor's Court that existed from 1686, and the dates when it ended vary across New York State. Now, this was mostly, again, a civil court, but they did hear some minor criminal cases. Then there were the Justices' Courts, okay? These were quite popular, and again, it was 1665, essentially to the present. Now, in the old Justices' Court, they were usually very informal. Oftentimes a case may actually take place in the justice's kitchen table, right? And the parties just sat there. So oftentimes these records did not survive long term, but you can find them from time to time. And they heard very minor civil cases and sometimes some misdemeanors, but mostly they were focused on the civil cases. And then there was the Supreme Court of Judicature from 1691 to present. Of course, today it's just known as the Supreme Court. They dropped those last two words in 1847. And again, for the genealogists, this is where you find those matrimonial cases, they're called. So those are your divorces, your separations, things like that. Okay, so the criminal courts. This first one, this is my favorite name for a court. This was the Court of Oyer and Terminer. You can see here it lasted in New York from 1683 to about 1895, and it was a county level court. Now, this court heard felony cases, including capital cases. So this court heard the very serious criminal stuff. Okay, so if you know that, unfortunately, your ancestor may have been involved in some sort of a serious criminal case, you'd know to look at the Court of Oyer and Terminer. There was also something called the Court of Sessions, okay? And this lasted from 1683 again to 1847. It was a county court that heard non-capital cases. So crimes that were just a bit less serious than that would have been heard in the Court of Sessions. A lot of that work was taken over in 1847 by courts that are familiar with us today, the county courts, which are the main criminal court outside of New York City. Okay, so if you're looking for criminal cases after 1847, the county court is your best bet. There was also a court of special sessions. This was in cities and towns, and they tended to hear minor criminal cases. And the dates they existed vary, so you'd have to check for each one. And then the police court, again, another popular court, and they heard minor criminal cases in the police court. Okay, that was usually smaller things like, public drunkenness or something like that. Like I said, if you haven't used court records yet, I definitely would. You can find a lot of great information in them. Even if it doesn't help you break down those brick walls, it's just can really help, fill in your ancestor's story. There are a lot of fun cases, the things that people used to sue each other for, name calling, silly things like that, can be quite fun. So here's just some tips on finding a case, right? You know your ancestor was involved in some kind of a case. What's the way to find it, right? You had all those different courts that existed over various times. So the first thing you want to do is research and say what records were available in that location where it happened, where your ancestor lived. So once you've got a list of that, you look at the time period and you look at what courts covered that particular time period. Then you take into account the nature of the case. Was it a civil case or a criminal case? And then you look to see what the nature of the criminal case was. Was it something fairly minor? Okay, you heard a story that great grandpa was arrested one time for, getting into a bar fight. Well, that would probably be in police court. If it was something more serious, he may have gone to the county court for something like that. So if you follow that, I think, you should be able to really kind of narrow down where you should be able to find that case. But also, of course, as always, keep in mind that, some records may have been destroyed over the years. They may have been burned in a fire, gotten lost, stolen, whatever. So again, in each county and location, you have to check to see what records have survived. Okay, probate records. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with these, but let's go over these quickly. So the probate is when a person dies and their estate needs to be legally settled. Now, normally it is settled in surrogate's court after 1787. Now, if you are looking for something before 1787, got a great tool for you. Again, go to the State Archives website, and there's something called the Probate Pathfinder, okay? And it gives you a lot of great information on how to find a probate record before 1787. And just so you know, we do have a number of these pathfinders on the State Archives website. And, we have them for court records, naturalization records, various things like that. So testate versus intestate. So if a person has died testate, that means they died with a will. If they died intestate, they did not have a will. Now, popular misconception, there are people who believe that if somebody dies intestate, there is no probate record. That's not true. Oftentimes, estates still had to be settled whether there was a will or not, and it would go to the probate court because all states have laws governing how estates should be settled. There are, things called heirs at law, who has a right to part of that estate. Now, conversely, though, keep in mind that not all estates are settled in court. Sometimes the family may have decided we agree on everything, there was nothing really to work out, and they just settled the estate themselves and it never made it to probate court. Or oftentimes, if the individual was poor, I've got some ancestors like this. If somebody died and they didn't own property and they had very few personal possessions, there really was nothing to probate. Okay, now many of these records are online, but do keep in mind many are still not. And I still think it's a really good idea to contact the local surrogates court about what records they have and go and do research there, even if you do see that these records are online. Records are located with the counties, and since the county clerks are not clerks of the surrogate court, normally they stay with the court themselves. Now, some counties do have archives, and sometimes the surrogates court for that county may send the older stuff to the county archives. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. And as I mentioned, many are digitized and online, but many still are not. And I would encourage you to still contact the surrogates court. Naturalization records. This is the process of becoming an American citizen. There are two parts to this, a declaration of intention and a naturalization. And again, I'm sure some of you have done this kind of research. Now, until 1906, the process was controlled by the state. And so the information that you could find, it often was not uniform and it often was limited. So you were lucky if it gave your ancestor's name, the year he came to the United States, and the year he actually took his naturalization oath. The federal government took control of the process in 1906, but keep in mind that your ancestor could still be naturalized in a state court. Now, some may have gone to a federal court, but most still went to a state court. The only difference here is now they had to follow those uniform standards set by the federal government. And naturalizations are held by the county clerks. Again, a lot are online, and sometimes counties. I can tell you that Albany County, and I was actually involved in this project when it started back in the 90s, they have indexed, and now they are actually scanning a lot of their naturalizations and putting them online. So if you don't belong to a subscription service like Ancestry, check out the county site. You may be able to find information for free right on their site. And I'm going to, I thought I had a, Oh, okay, there we go. That one got mixed up a little bit here. This is an example of a declaration of intention. It's from 1933, so it is post 1906, and you can see here, hopefully you can see this well on your screen, it gives a ton of great information. So for this man here, you could see not only says he was born in Poland, but it actually gives you the exact city where he was born in Poland. It gives you his birth date, same information for his wife. It lists all his children, where they were born and their birth dates. So this is really great information. And of course, you could see the big thing here is at the bottom of the screen, they actually have his picture. So if you didn't have a picture of the person, now you do. So this is what I mean about the great information you can find on the post 1906 naturalizations. Okay, military records. We often don't think local government when we think military records. We usually go to the feds for that, or sometimes even the state. But early on, local governments determined military eligibility. And if you look at a lot of the older, like town records, you will find a lot of military records. So for instance, lists of persons who are eligible for military duty. List of soldiers, officers, and seamen, you'll find sometimes. Militia tax, okay, people had to pay a tax to support the militia. And then the militia rolls, and again, oftentimes you'll find these in the old town books, and these are all a person in town who were part of the militia. When the militia got together, they would essentially take a roll call of all the people over there. So you can find out whether your ancestor was actually in the militia. Now, a special note on veterans' discharge records. Now, this started at the end of World War I, and veterans were encouraged, okay, they weren't mandated to, they were encouraged to file their veterans' discharge records with the county clerk. Okay, so again, it was up to them, it was completely voluntary. And the records are restricted. So if you were interested in getting some, older records, I would contact the county clerk to talk to them about access, whether you're entitled to get a copy, and then whether they might actually have a copy of, say, your grandfather, great-grandfather, whatever, military record. Assessment and taxations. These are another really good one. So for those of you who own property, you know that taxation is based on the assessed value of your property, right? They assess the value, they come up with a tax rate, they apply it, and they figure out what your tax bill is. So remember, all local governments tax, okay? That's their revenue stream, but only some do the assessment. And generally, it's the towns and cities and sometimes villages, but oftentimes villages will allow the towns to do that assessing. So once they do that assessment, what they do, that final assessment roll that they create, from that, they then create something called a final tax roll. And that's basically the assessment information, then with all the tax collection records, okay? And I'm going to show you an example of this in a moment. So Here's an important thing to remember. So the final tax rolls are kept by the counties, except of course we have an exception here. In Westchester, they're kept by the municipalities, okay? Now, according to retention schedules, those are permanent records. Municipalities keep a copy of that record for 10 years. Legally, they have to keep it for at least that. I can tell you from experience, oftentimes the municipalities will keep them long-term, usually permanently. So if you can't find them at the county level, you should also be able to find them at the municipal level. Okay, and here are some great things about taxation and assessment. One thing is they're great for tracking your ancestor between the censuses, right? They're only taken once every 10 years. So I think it's important to use these records because you can't always assume because your ancestor lived, say if they lived in the town of Islip on Long Island in 1850, and then they lived there again in the census in 1860, that they were there the whole time. They may have moved away and come back. And by using the taxation records, you can track them from year to year, see, did they disappear at some point? And then, you might need to do some more research to see where they went. Also, it's an excellent replacement for the 1890 census, which was destroyed in a fire. And you could learn some interesting facts about your ancestor, his economic status, who his neighbors were, and often fun little facts like, did he own a dog? At one time, New York State, oftentimes local governments taxed you, gave you special tax if you owned a dog. And why was that? You had to support the local dog pound. And oftentimes it will actually note whether it was a female dog, because since females have puppies, they were actually taxed at a higher rate than male dogs. And yes, they did actually use the official word for a female dog, the one that rhymes with witch. So it's kind of funny when you're looking through the records and you see that in a column, but that's because they got taxed at a higher rate. So here is an example. This is from Broome County from the 1820s. So this one doesn't have as much information as some later ones will, but you can still see, that they give the name of the taxpayer, what the assessment of his real property was. And sometimes you could see the personal property in that one column, and then the total, and then what they were taxed. So, again, you could look at this and you could see you could see the name at the very top, Henry Babcock. You could see his real estate was only $50, which was significantly lower than most other people, right? So you get an idea of his economic status, where this man down here with the kind of funny sounding name of Ransom Batty, his was worth $1,200. And again, that was noticeably higher than most of his neighbors. So he was probably one of the wealthier, more prominent folks in this particular town. So, I would encourage you to look for these records if you've not done that before. So let's start talking about some other records that maybe you've never thought about or weren't familiar with. Now, one's called historian's files. So every municipality, every county, city, town, village, by law is supposed to have an historian appointed. I could let you know that they don't always do that. Most of them do. And the historian can be a great resource. So oftentimes historians will collect information records from say local citizens. Maybe back in the 1950s, somebody deposited with a local historian an unpublished genealogy or family history, and that might actually have some really interesting information for you that you can't find anyplace else. So I would always contact a local historian and say, hey, can I do some research in your historian files? Because what happens by law is all these significant records that the historian collects, they do officially become local government records. They are covered by retention schedules with a permanent retention period. And you can find some great stuff in that. And also, I would also encourage you to talk to the local historian. Oftentimes, that person will just have some really great information in their head that they can share with you. The minutes of the town board meeting, the governing board there, oftentimes a lot of great information, and especially the older ones, again, where they put a lot of the town's business in there and they didn't separate it out. So they may have been discussing, the overseer and the poor, and, who's going to receive relief from the town, things like that, why they're receiving that relief from the town. And again, if some of those are your ancestors, you can get some really great information. I can tell you personally that I have in my research a chattel mortgage. So what's a chattel mortgage, if you haven't heard of this before? Well, a chattel mortgage was a mortgage on essentially movable property, so not real property. So for instance, in the early 20th century, a lot of farmers, when tractors first came out, right, very expensive, they would get a mortgage on that tractor. And a lot of towns have kept these records over the years. And you can, again, find some really good information in there. So, nowadays you'd think of a chattel mortgage, say, almost like a car loan, right? You get a loan on your car, and technically, right, the bank owns your car until you pay it off. Same concept with a chattel mortgage. And then the town books I mentioned before. Just one thing to remember about them, again, all the town's records are in that one book, but it doesn't always go in strict chronological order. So these folks were very frugal. Okay, so if Farmer Brown came to the town clerk and they said, hey, my wife had a baby over the winter, and this is his name and this is the date he was born, he might open that book, find a little space in there, maybe under the town board meetings, and say, Joseph Smith was born on such and such a date in 1852. But then you might turn the page and there's a record from 1870. So an 1850s record might be recorded in the 18 whatever section. So what you have to do is really go page by page. And I always encourage people, if your ancestors lived in a particular town, say for a generation or so, I would just really read that thing from cover to cover. It can get a bit tedious. I've actually done this a couple of times myself in my own research, but also you can find out some really great information by going through those books. And you also get a good overview of the town's history as well. Okay, here's some other miscellaneous and fun records. Highway records. Years ago, people were given a choice when the town was building or the county was building a highway. You could essentially pay a tax, so maybe $10. But if you didn't want to pay that $10 tax, they'd say, okay, what you can do is you can actually work on the highway for 10 days. So again, kind of a fun record to look at. So earmarks are another one. Again, this is when people would record what earmarks they used on their cattle, and they would be recorded in the old town record. So this way they could prove, hey, this is actually my cow, it's not your cow. But again, it can help you place your ancestor in a certain place and a certain time, and it tells you something about him. Okay, he was wealthy enough to own some cattle. Okay, not everybody was. Registers of professions. These were usually kept by the county clerk. So these would be your folks in towns, your lawyers, your doctors, people like that, and a register of those folks were kept. People sometimes overlook that, yes, northern states did have slavery at one time. We got rid of it long before the South did, but there are these records in the counties and the towns and villages. When a slave was freed, it was called a manumission record. Okay, this could be quite interesting as well. Election records, enrollment registers. Usually not a ton of information in here, but again, If you're having trouble finding your ancestor, you might be able to find him in the enrollment registers. And again, you could find out some interesting information. Oftentimes it did record what party they were in. So, you could see, what did my ancestor have similar political beliefs for that I did. County clerks keep something called a miscellaneous record book. Now, the law says that you can, as a citizen, go down and record any record you want to with the county clerk. And again, if you're having trouble finding information on your ancestor, you may want to go through some of these miscellaneous record books, because maybe they recorded something important in those books. Now, I'm going to give you an example here of a fire district record. Now, yes, I know, as genealogists, usually the last thing you're going to think of are fire district records, right? But these are really great community-based records. So think about it. The fire districts, now fire districts, just so you know, essentially they only cover towns. Very rarely they will also cover a village. But when you think fire districts, think town. So if your ancestor lived in a town, he may have been involved with a fire district. Like I said, these are great community-based records, because when you think about it, your fire district, right, they're always involved in a local, say, Memorial Day parade. They work closely with the school districts. They'll work with other organizations like the Boy Scouts. And oftentimes you'll find that the most prominent members of a community were oftentimes involved with the fire district. Even today, I notice, working with local government officials, a lot of town clerks also work for the fire district. They're also often the fire district secretary. So, again, I know those aren't the first records you're going to go for, but if you want to learn more about a local community, or again, if you're desperate, you're not finding records. And also too, if records of the town had been destroyed, like say, unfortunately, there was a fire at Town Hall in 1962, a lot of records were destroyed. You're looking for some information on your ancestors from 1900, and the fire district records have survived. Might be a bit of a long shot, but I would check that out. And just so you know, we do have some local government records at the New York State Archives. Between 1990 and 2000, there was a requirement, if you got a grant from the New York State Archives, to microfilm records. So if a county, a town, a village, got one of these grants, they had to send a copy of that microfilm to the New York State Archives. We stopped doing that in 2000, mostly because we really didn't have enough space to do it. But we have held on from that microfilm. And if you go to the State Archives website, you can look through our finding aids and our catalog and find some of these records. So if you find yourself ever needing to go to Albany to do some research, you might be able to kill two birds with one stone, because maybe the local government you're looking to research might have some records at the New York State Archives. And here is just, that sample I told you from the fire districts from 1939. This is a roll call from a fire district in Saratoga County. You can see it has here what genealogists love, and that is, a list of names. So like I said, if you're, kind of in desperate straits looking for an ancestor, maybe from late 19th, early 20th century, you can find some of these further back in some area, but generally you'll find them from late 19th century forward. And again, you can find some interesting information, like, hey, was your ancestor the local fire chief? Okay, so just some quick tips on accessing New York State local government records. First is to check familysearch.org. Now, here's what I've noticed, especially since I've done a lot of research in New England. Family Search does have a good amount of county records for New York State, but I've noticed for like cities, towns, villages, there is not much. And I think you're going to have to end up actually going to the municipality for those records. As I said before, set up a free Ancestry New York account, right? If you're not already an Ancestry member, you don't want to pay for it, at least you could see New York State records there. Then visit the local government's websites. Now, on some websites, they do provide information about what kind of records they have. And if you're lucky, some of them have actually digitized and put records online. Dutchess County has digitized and indexed a lot of what they call their ancient document collections. So they go back into the 18th, 19th century. And they've done a really nice job on that. So if you have ancestors from down that way, you know, the lower Hudson Valley region, I would definitely check that out. But always check out the local government website to see what they have. And also always inquire about what kind of research services they have. Some towns may say, well, we'll do some research for you, but we're going to charge you X amount of money. Some may not offer any services at all, but then it's good to inquire about, you know, are there any local genealogists or researchers that you can hire if you can't actually visit yourself. And here are some of the best local government contacts. Now for counties, one of your main people, of course, is going to be the clerk, but also that historian. Now, something a lot of New Yorkers are not aware of. There is a person also called the Records Management Officer, often referred to as an RMO. Now, again, state law says all local governments must have an RMO. I can tell you not all of them do, although most of them do. They could be a good person also to talk to because they will be familiar with the records collections. And oftentimes the county clerk is the RMO. Pretty much ditto with the cities, right? It's the clerk, historian, and the records management officer. Now with towns and villages, good news is by law that the clerks are the records management officer. And again, they should have an historian that you can talk to. School districts, probably the best person to talk to first is the district clerk. And you could also talk to the records management officer as well. But don't be surprised if you contacted a school district and said, may I talk to your records management officer? They don't say, what's a records management officer? They just might not have one. And fire districts, it's the district secretary, again, by law, and they're always going to be the best person to talk to at a fire district if you do get interested in looking at those records. Okay, so keep in mind, many counties do have good archival programs. You know, I can think of lots of them off the top of my head: Westchester, Albany. Up near you folks, Ontario County has actually an excellent program. Washington County, Warren County, up in the Lake George area. But many local governments do not, right? They're really not equipped to provide, you know, researcher services. So, you know, my advice would be, you know, just be patient when you call people and talk to them about what kind of records they have and what kind of access that they can provide to those records. Okay, because like I said, many are not well equipped. Now, I've been working with local government officials for decades. Most of them are very helpful. They're public servants. They like being public servants. They like helping people. But I'm going to be blunt. Every once in a while, you will run into kind of a jerk who's going to be a bit difficult and not very helpful, and may ask you to fill out a FOIL request for everything you want to look at. But keep in mind, most of them, I think you'll find very helpful. Okay, so we have come down to the question period, and you know, so I know I gave you a quick overview of a lot of stuff. So if there's anything people want to learn more about in the future, say like, you know, you want to learn more about court records or, you know, school records, things like that, let me know, and I can always do a more focused presentation on that sometime in the future if that ever interests anybody. But do we have any questions?
I do have a couple of questions. I did want to mention the slide for records access laws. It was slide 22. That was the one that was right after the naturalized records, and then you skipped it to go to the
Yes, and I don't know how that happened because I was just going over this today. And that was supposed to be at the end. Here we go. Okay. Yeah, so you can see here records access law. So the Freedom of Information law, okay, guarantees access to everybody, even if you're not a New York State resident or not a resident of the of that local government. Now you would have to, if there is some question about what you can access, or if a local official is giving you trouble about accessing a record you think you should have access to, you'd want to contact the Committee on Local Government. They can help you with that. But there's also something that's kind of a counterbalance. It's called, to FOIL, it's called the Personal Privacy Protection Law. And that's meant to protect people's privacy, personal information, anything people can use to steal someone's identity or just violate their privacy, because they want to make sure that, certain records do not mistakenly get released under FOIL that shouldn't be. And then there is HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. Unfortunately, this has helped restrict records to the old, we used to call them, insane asylums and things like that, because they're medical records. And since the law isn't clear, sometimes they'll say that HIPAA covers, somebody who was alive in 1880. Now, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, or FERPA, that controls access to the school records, and it limits it to the student and the parent. However, there is something in FERPA called the 100-year rule. If a record is over 100 years, it is open, and they really should provide you access to that record. The other exception with FERPA is if a person is known to be dead. Now, honestly, I don't know quite how you would be able to prove that. In some cases, if it's somebody who was in the school in the 1930s, 40s, the district would probably believe that, yes, there's a good chance that person has passed on already, and they'll give you access to the record. I don't know, they could ask you for a copy of a death certificate if they're really that concerned about it. But so that was records access law. So questions?
Yes.
So I actually had a couple that came in
Okay.
on here first, and then I'll come out to you guys. So according to the land records, this was, what if they rented and did not own property?
Now, sometimes if they leased land, yeah, that sometimes was recorded. And again, I've seen this in my own research. I don't know if everybody always did it. But if it's somebody like, say, in more modern times, renting an apartment, something like that, no, that wouldn't be recorded. But sometimes people used to lease farmland from other people, and that would be recorded oftentimes in the land records. Yes.
Okay. And then how about small claims courts? When were they first established? Are there records available, and where would they be found?
Well, a small claims court in the old days, we'd have to go back to, those defunct courts. So some of those courts that heard the minor civil cases, I would say probably in the justices' courts. So if those records survived in that locality, if you're looking for something like a small claims court, it would be the justices' courts.
Okay.
Mike?
David, my question has to do with the manumissions and chattel.
Okay.
Slaves were considered to be chattel. New York State was the 6th largest slave state in the Union. And were there any chattel mortgages taken out on slaves? And where are the slave records in New York State for the different municipalities? Where would we find them?
Now, in some cases, now I'm not sure about the chattel mortgages covering slaves? That's a good question. I'm not aware of it myself. I haven't done a lot of, research in that area. So I'm not too familiar with that question. And also that where they're located. Like again, sometimes you might just find them scattered throughout, the old town books, things like that. I know in some cases they may have kept like a separate book of manumissions. And again, it does just differ so much from municipality to municipality of where they might be. Sometimes you'll find them at a town level. Sometimes the counties had them, the county clerks may have kept records of manumissions. So again, those you got to do a little digging for.
Oh, I was, with the school census records, would that include private schools like Catholic schools too?
That is an excellent question. But, I have to say, I don't know. I've never worked with the private school ones, just with the public ones. My inclination would probably be yes, there probably were records like that.
Oh, okay.
Any other questions? Go ahead.
So yes, the question I have is about adoption. So if I know I thought there was a new law where previously the adoption records were sealed, and we're looking for information on, for instance, my grandmother's adoption. And where would we start or something like that?
You would start with the county clerk's office to see what records, and they could tell you a bit about the legalities.
So the county clerk of where they were born?
Yeah, the county, if you know where they were born, yeah, the county clerk there.
But what if you don't know where they were born? I mean, just you knew where they were adopted, but when they were.
Yeah, then start there, and you may have to do some research back. I know I do have some information at the office, but if there's a question you need more clarification on, I would be happy, if Nancy wanted to forward me any questions that need a bit more detail, I would happy to do a little bit of research and send it back to you.
That'd be great, thank you.
Okay.
Any other questions from the in-person audience? Or, let's see here. So Wendy says the Diocese of Brooklyn does have some Catholic school records. Interesting, Betty.
Yeah, just so folks know, sometimes when a private school, whether it's religious or not, goes under sometimes the records will end up with the state education department in Albany, but there are laws too that say they may end up with for those of you familiar with the BOCES, sometimes it can end up with the BOCES or the school district where that private school was. So again, that's one thing, if your ancestors went to a private school that's gone out of business, again, it takes a little bit of legwork to do some research about where the records may have ended up, and hopefully they didn't end up getting lost over the years. But
Any other questions? All right, David, thank you so much.
Thank you.
oh, thank you.
Yeah, we really appreciate this good information. As I said, it is being recorded. I imagine it'll be early next week before we get it up on our YouTube channel. And I will be sending out the follow-up email with another copy of the handout, and I think there's some good information in the chat too, so I'll send that out as well. And we're gonna be taking a break for December and we'll start off again in January. So thank you all for coming tonight. Thanks for everybody on Zoom. Always appreciate the support we get for this genealogy group. And have a great holiday season.
Okay, you too.
Thank you. Thanks, Dave.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye.
Nancy.
Bye. Thank you so much. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy.
I didn't get to chat with Larry online.
The genealogy group that I've contacted across Philly, I saw someone when they were saying where they were from Coburg.
Yeah.
So they've started doing in person, but they also are still doing Zooms.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
but I just think it's really fun
It is.
that, because I was the one who told them about, you know, Jane Clark.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Send the registration information for proof. I was like, oh, it's okay.
Yeah.
Yes, so that's awesome.
Yeah.